My son Henry did this to me while I was sleeping. The silence of that night was a lie. It whispered promises of calm, but it concealed truths far more complicated than I could have ever imagined. My body relaxed against the mattress, my mind adrift in dreams, while the world around me seemed to hold its breath. But even as sleep cradled me like an old friend, there were forces at play, forces that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. I woke up to the faintest sensation, something so subtle it might have been dismissed as a dream if not for the weight of reality pressing down on me. A warmth, unexpected and intimate, lingered near my skin, a presence that shouldn't have been there. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the cat had jumped onto the bed without waking me fully. Yet, deep inside, I felt a tremor of unease, a quiet voice urging me to open my eyes. When I did, the room remained cloaked in shadows, the moonlight casting long, eerie stripes across the walls. And then I saw him, or rather, I felt him. Henry, my son, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow, leaning over me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His face was close, too close, and the air between us grew heavy with unspoken tension. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of confusion, a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. What was he doing? Why was he here, in this moment, when the rest of the house slept soundly? The questions swirled in my mind, each one louder than the last, drowning out the soothing hum of the crickets outside. And then came the touch, the soft brush of fingers along my arm, gentle yet deliberate, sending shivers through me that had nothing to do with cold. It wasn't the kind of touch a mother expects from her child, it carried a charge, an electricity that made my pulse quicken. For a fleeting second, I froze, unsure whether to pull away or let it happen, caught between instinct and disbelief. Henry didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could, painting a picture I wasn't ready to see. This wasn't the innocent boy who'd once tugged at my sleeve asking for bedtime stories. This was someone else entirely, someone whose intentions blurred the lines of what was right and wrong, natural and unnatural. As the seconds stretched into minutes, I grappled with the enormity of what was unfolding. How had we gotten here? When had our relationship shifted from parent and child to this? Was it something I'd missed, some sign I'd ignored in the chaos of daily life? Or was it always there, hidden beneath layers of familiarity and routine? In that moment, lying still under the weight of his gaze, I realized the truth: nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Relationships are complex, messy things, shaped by history, desire, and sometimes, secrets we don't even recognize until they're staring us in the face. And now, those secrets threatened to consume me, leaving behind a trail of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. But one thing was certain: I would never look at Henry the same way again. The touch lingered, a ghost of warmth that seemed to seep into my skin, rooting me to the spot. My mind raced, searching for clarity, but all I found was a storm of conflicting emotions: confusion, arousal, betrayal. Henry's hand moved again, this time tracing the curve of my shoulder, deliberate and unhurried, as though he had every right to be there. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat like stones. Instead, I watched him, his face half hidden in shadow, trying to decipher the look in his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a son, they were the eyes of someone who saw me differently now, someone who had crossed a line neither of us could ever uncross. And then, without warning, his lips pressed against mine. It wasn't a kiss born of innocence or affection, it was something else entirely, raw and urgent, demanding a response I couldn't give. My body betrayed me before my mind could catch up, responding instinctively to the pressure, the heat, the intimacy of it all. For a moment, I forgot where we were, who we were supposed to be to each other. All that mattered was the sensation, the way his breath mingled with mine, the way his fingers curled possessively around my wrist. When he finally pulled away, I lay there, frozen, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating, the air thick with unspoken truths. Henry didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't offer any kind of explanation. He simply stared at me, waiting for what, I wasn't sure. A reaction. Permission. Forgiveness. "Henry," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling like a leaf in the wind. But the word hung between us, heavy with meaning, unanswered and unresolved. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You feel it too, don't you?" His voice was low, almost hypnotic, carrying a certainty that made my stomach twist. How could he say such things? How could he believe them? And yet, deep down, I knew he was right. There was something between us, something forbidden and electric, a connection neither of us could deny. Before I could respond, he kissed me again, harder this time, more insistent, as if trying to silence the questions swirling in my head. My resistance faltered, crumbling beneath the weight of his urgency. Somewhere in the haze of desire and guilt, I stopped fighting. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the part of me that had always known this moment was inevitable. As the night wore on, the boundaries between right and wrong blurred further, dissolving into a tangled web of sensations and secrets. Each touch, each whisper, carried the weight of our shared transgression, binding us together in ways no one else would understand. We weren't just mother and son anymore, we were something else, something undefined, something dangerous. When dawn finally broke, painting the room in soft golden light, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding like a drum. Henry was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the memory of what we'd done. I should have been horrified, consumed by shame and regret. And maybe I was, on some level. But beneath that, there was something else, a spark of excitement, a thrill that made my pulse quicken whenever I thought about it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever this was between us, it had only just begun. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew deep down that I wasn't ready to let it go. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the bed where I still lay, tangled in the sheets. My body ached with a strange mix of exhaustion and awareness, every nerve ending alive as though it had been rewired overnight. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I knew Henry must have left already, slipping away like smoke before anyone else could wake up. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling as they brushed against the cool fabric of the blanket. Last night felt both vivid and surreal, like a dream I couldn't shake off. Yet the evidence was there, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the imprint of his fingers on my skin, the memory of his lips pressed against mine. It wasn't a dream. It was real, and now it was mine to carry. As I moved through the motions of getting ready for the day, the tension inside me grew heavier. How could I face him? How could I look at him over breakfast, hear his voice, see the casual way he might smile or laugh, knowing what we'd done? And how could I face myself, knowing that part of me didn't regret it, not entirely? By the time I reached the kitchen, the house seemed smaller, suffocating. The clink of dishes from the sink echoed unnaturally loud, each sound amplifying my unease. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the steam rise around me, trying to steady my breathing. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the fact that everything had changed. Henry walked into the room then, carrying himself with an ease that made my stomach twist. He glanced at me briefly, long enough for our eyes to meet, and in that split second, I saw it, the same spark of recognition, the same unspoken understanding. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, and then he turned away, pretending nothing was different. "Morning," he said casually, opening the fridge and pulling out the orange juice. His tone was light, almost teasing, but I heard the underlying current beneath it. "Good morning," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to say something, to confront him, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I busied myself with stirring sugar into my coffee, avoiding his gaze. He leaned against the counter, watching me with a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You seem off today." The casual use of Mom stung more than I expected. It was a reminder of everything we weren't supposed to be, a barrier he had crossed without hesitation. I forced myself to meet his eyes, searching for some sign of guilt, of remorse. But all I found was confidence, an unsettling certainty that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm fine," I said finally, though my voice wavered slightly. "Just tired." "Tired?" He raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting into something darker, more provocative. "Or maybe you're thinking about last night." My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, unsure if I'd imagined those words or if he'd actually spoken them aloud. When I looked up, his smirk had widened, confirming that he'd said exactly what I thought he had. "Don't," I whispered, glancing toward the doorway, half expecting someone else to walk in. "Not here." "Why not?" he countered, taking a step closer. His proximity made my pulse quicken, each breath shallow and uneven. "Afraid someone will find out? Or are you afraid of what you'll do if they don't?" His words were a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at my feet. They ignited a fire within me, a mixture of anger and desire that left me reeling. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and we both froze, staring at each other like two predators caught in the act. It was my husband, Henry's father, stepping into the kitchen, oblivious to the silent war raging between us. He greeted us cheerfully, pouring himself a cup of coffee and launching into a story about work. I forced myself to nod along, smiling weakly, while Henry played the part of the dutiful son, laughing at all the right moments. But beneath the surface, the tension crackled like electricity, threatening to consume us both. Every glance, every subtle movement, carried meaning neither of us dared to voice aloud. We were walking a tightrope, balancing precariously between deception and desire, and one misstep could send us plummeting into chaos. And yet, despite the risk, despite the weight of what we'd done, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. It was wrong, dangerous, and impossible to explain. But it was also undeniable, a force stronger than either of us. As I watched him across the table, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, and desires I couldn't suppress. The day dragged on, each moment stretching into an eternity. I found myself stealing glances at Henry whenever I thought no one was looking, his profile as he scrolled through his phone, the way his fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the table, the faint smirk that played on his lips when he caught me watching him. Every small gesture seemed loaded with meaning, a silent dialogue only we could understand. By late afternoon, the house had emptied out. My husband had gone to a meeting, and the younger children were off at school, leaving just the two of us alone in the quiet expanse of our home. The air felt heavier now, charged with unspoken tension. We avoided each other for the most part, but every accidental brush of shoulders or shared glance reignited the fire simmering beneath the surface. I retreated to the garden, seeking solace among the flowers and the hum of bees. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. I bent down to pluck a wilting bloom from its stem, my mind wandering back to the night before, the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze. Part of me wanted to push it away, to pretend it hadn't happened. But another part, a darker, more compelling part, wanted nothing more than to feel it again. "Hiding out here." His voice startled me, though I shouldn't have been surprised. He stood at the edge of the garden, hands casually shoved into his pockets, his posture relaxed yet somehow predatory. "I needed some fresh air," I said, straightening up and brushing dirt from my palms. My heart raced, betraying my attempt at nonchalance. "Fresh air, huh?" He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. Or maybe you're trying to avoid me. I'm not avoiding anyone, I shot back, though my tone lacked conviction. His smile widened, slow and deliberate, like a cat toying with its prey. You're terrible at lying, you know that. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his presence overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The scent of earth and grass mingled with his cologne, creating a heady mix that made my head spin. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingertips grazing my cheek in the process. Don't stop me, he murmured, his voice low and husky, sending shivers down my spine. Stop what? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. This. Without waiting for a reply, his lips found mine, urgent and demanding, erasing any semblance of resistance I might have mustered. This kiss was different from last night, less hesitant, more consuming, as if he'd spent the day planning exactly how to unravel me. I should have pulled away, should have pushed him back and ended this madness once and for all. But instead, I let myself melt into him, surrendering to the heat of the moment. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, until there was no space left between us. When he finally broke the kiss, we were both breathless, our chests rising and falling in sync. For a moment, neither of us spoke, lost in the aftermath of what we'd done. Then, slowly, he leaned his forehead against mine, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. We can't keep doing this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Why not? He countered, his thumb tracing lazy circles along my wrist. It feels right, doesn't it? Even if it's wrong. His words struck a chord deep within me, stirring emotions I didn't want to confront. He was right, in a twisted, forbidden way, this connection felt real, visceral, alive. And that scared me more than anything else. Right or wrong, it doesn't change the fact that we're mother and son, I said, my voice firmer now, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. He chuckled softly, stepping back slightly but keeping his grip on my hand. And yet, here we are, he said, his tone laced with amusement. Doesn't that tell you something? I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps approaching froze us both. We sprang apart, guilt written plainly across our faces as my youngest child appeared around the corner, oblivious to the storm raging between us. Mom! Can you help me with my homework? She called, her voice bright and innocent. Of course, sweetie, I replied, forcing a smile as I turned away from Henry. But even as I walked toward the house, his gaze burned into my back, a promise of things to come. Later that evening, after the kids were tucked into bed and the house fell silent, I found myself drawn back to the bedroom where it had all begun. The moonlight streamed through the blinds, painting the room in silvery hues, just like last night. And there he was, waiting for me, his silhouette framed by the window. You came, he said, his voice soft but triumphant. What are we doing, Henry? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay strong. Whatever we want, he replied, stepping closer, his eyes dark with desire. Who's going to stop us? And as his arms wrapped around me once more, I realized the truth, nothing, and no one, could. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and whispered promises. Each night, under the cover of darkness, we found ourselves drawn back to each other like moths to a flame, despite the guilt, despite the risk, despite everything we knew we should have stopped. Yet, it wasn't just about desire anymore, it was something deeper, more complex. A tangled web of emotions that neither of us could untangle, let alone escape. But clarity comes when you least expect it, often disguised as chaos. It started with a slip, a careless moment that unraveled everything. One evening, after Henry had left my room, I heard footsteps outside the door. My heart stopped. I froze, clutching the sheet to my chest, praying it was nothing more than my imagination. But then the doorknob turned slowly, creaking open just enough for me to see his father standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. His expression shifted from shock to anger, then to something else entirely, something raw and broken. He didn't say a word. Instead, he backed away silently, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than any scream ever could. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking uncontrollably. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, suffocating, unbearable. Everything we'd built, every lie we'd told, every secret we'd kept, it all came crashing down in that one fleeting moment. Henry returned minutes later, oblivious to what had happened until I told him. His reaction was immediate, visceral. "He knows," he demanded, pacing the room like a caged animal. "What are we going to do?" "Do?" I repeated, my voice rising with hysteria. "We're not doing anything. This ends now, Henry. It has to." "No," he said firmly, stopping in front of me. "We don't stop because someone finds out. If anything, this proves how real this is. How much we need each other." His words were like acid, burning through the fragile barrier I tried so desperately to maintain. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the idea that what we shared was worth fighting for. But another part, the rational, terrified part, knew it couldn't last. That it shouldn't last. "I can't lose my family," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Not for this. Not for us." And in that moment, I realized the truth: love isn't always enough. Sometimes, it's the hardest thing to walk away from, even when walking away is the only choice left. Days turned into weeks, and though the tension in our home remained thick enough to cut with a knife, we both made the decision to step back, to sever the dangerous thread that bound us together. It wasn't easy. Every glance, every accidental touch, carried the weight of what we'd lost and what we'd sacrificed. But over time, the intensity dimmed, replaced by a quiet ache neither of us could fully extinguish. Henry distanced himself, throwing himself into schoolwork and late-night outings with friends. I focused on the kids, on keeping the facade intact, on pretending everything was fine when inside, I was falling apart. Our lives went on, separate yet intertwined, forever marked by the choices we'd made. Looking back now, I still wonder if we could have chosen differently, if there was ever a way to avoid the mess we created. But the truth is, some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some relationships exist solely to test your limits, to push you further than you thought possible, and then leave you changed forever. My son Henry did this to me while I was sleeping. I'm still in shock. But maybe, just maybe, the shock isn't just about what happened. Maybe it's about who I became in the process. And perhaps, in its own twisted way, that's the most unsettling part of all. The days that followed were a blur of tension and guilt, each moment heavy with the weight of what had been uncovered. My husband's silence was deafening, his presence in the house now suffocating. He didn't confront me directly, not yet, but the way he looked at me, the careful distance he kept, spoke volumes. I could feel it in every glance, every shared meal, every forced conversation. Something had broken between us, something irreplaceable. As for Henry, he seemed to retreat further into himself, avoiding eye contact and disappearing for hours at a time. Yet, even in his absence, I felt him, his presence lingering like a ghost, haunting the corners of my mind. The pull I'd once felt toward him hadn't disappeared. It had simply transformed into something darker, more painful. It gnawed at me, reminding me of what we'd done and the price we'd paid. But the question lingered: why? Why had this happened? How had it come to this? It wasn't until later, during one of those sleepless nights, that I began to piece together the truth. Henry had always been different from the other children, more observant, more sensitive to the undercurrents of our family life. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, he'd sensed the cracks in our marriage long before I had. My husband and I had grown distant over the years, consumed by work, parenting, and the endless grind of daily life. We stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped truly seeing each other. Our relationship became transactional, built on habit rather than connection. And while I told myself it was normal, that all marriages went through phases, deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Henry must have seen it too, the lack of affection, the strained silences, the unspoken resentment. Maybe he thought he could fill the void, become the person I needed when my husband couldn't, or wouldn't. Or maybe it was simpler than that, maybe he'd always seen me as more than just his mother, and the opportunity presented itself in that quiet, vulnerable night. Whatever the reason, the damage was done. And now, it was up to me to fix it, or try to. Confronting my husband was harder than I imagined. I found him in the garage one evening, working on his car as if nothing had changed. The engine hummed softly in the background, filling the space with a rhythmic drone that almost drowned out the tension between us. "I need to talk to you," I said finally, standing in the doorway. He turned off the engine and wiped his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate, controlled. "About what?" he asked, though we both knew exactly what. "Us," I replied. "Everything." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, leaning against the hood of the car. "I don't know where to start," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I," I said, taking a step closer. "But we have to. Because if we don't, if we keep pretending everything's fine when it's not, then we're going to lose everything." His gaze met mine, searching, weighing the words I'd spoken. "You already did," he said, his voice tinged with pain. "With him." "I know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "And I can't undo it. But I can tell you why, and I can promise you it will never happen again." We sat on the steps leading into the house, side by side but not touching, as I poured out everything I'd kept buried for so long. I told him about the distance between us, about how I'd felt invisible, unimportant. I admitted that I'd let our marriage slip away, bit by bit, until there was almost nothing left. And I confessed that Henry, in his own twisted way, had filled a void I should have addressed with him. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Do you still feel that way about him?" "No," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "Not anymore. Whatever it was, it's gone. All that's left is regret." "And me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Do you still feel that way about me?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "But I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or ever. All I'm asking is for us to try, to rebuild what we lost." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's try." It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and lingering shadows of the past. But for the first time in years, I felt hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As for Henry, our bond was forever fractured. We avoided each other, speaking only when necessary, and even then, our conversations were stiff, formal. The fire that had once burned between us was extinguished, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of what we'd shared and what we'd destroyed. In time, he moved out, citing college plans and a desire for independence. I didn't argue. Watching him leave was painful, but it was also necessary, a clean break from the mess we'd created. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet of our home, I think about all that's happened, the choices we made, the lives we touched, the relationships we broke and rebuilt. It's not perfect, but it's ours. And for the first time in a long time, I feel alive, not because of passion or desire, but because of the simple, imperfect beauty of starting over. I'm still in shock. But maybe, just maybe, that shock has awakened something else, a chance to heal, to grow, to become someone stronger, braver, and truer than I ever thought possible. The house is quiet now, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you wonder if the world outside has forgotten to breathe. My husband and I have found a semblance of peace, a fragile truce, but the echoes of what happened still linger in the air, unseen but ever present. Henry's absence leaves a void, not just in the home but in my heart. Yet, as much as I ache for him, I know this distance is necessary. For both of us. Some wounds need time to heal, and some bonds are better left severed. But the story doesn't end here, not really. It never does. Life moves forward, relentless and unyielding, forcing us to confront the choices we've made and the consequences they carry. And though I've tried to rebuild, to move past the guilt and shame, there are moments when the memories creep back, uninvited yet unavoidable. A fleeting touch, a whispered word, a glance exchanged across a crowded room, all of it comes rushing back, sharp and vivid, reminding me of the complexity of human desire and the fragility of family ties. One evening, months after Henry moved out, I find myself alone in the garden, where it all began. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their petals brushing against one another in a silent dance. It's peaceful here, almost serene, but beneath the surface, I feel the weight of everything that's transpired. A rustle from behind makes me turn, expecting nothing more than a stray leaf or an errant gust of wind. Instead, I see him, Henry. He stands at the edge of the garden, his silhouette framed by the fading light, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us speaks. The air between us crackles with unspoken words, unresolved feelings, and unanswered questions. "I didn't think you'd come back," I say finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I had to," he replies, taking a step closer. "There are things I need to say. Things you haven't already." I ask, my tone sharper than intended. He hesitates, then nods. "Yes. Things I couldn't say before. About us. About everything." "What is there to say?" I ask, though I already know the answer. "We both know what we did was wrong. Irreparable. There's no fixing it." "No," he agrees, his voice soft but resolute. "But maybe there's understanding. Maybe there's closure." I watch him, searching his face for any sign of regret, of remorse. But what I see instead is something else, something raw and honest. Pain. Confusion. Love. Not the kind of love that should exist between a mother and her son, but love nonetheless. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admit, my voice breaking slightly. "Or myself." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he says, stepping closer until there's only a sliver of space between us. "I'm asking for honesty. For truth. Because without it, we'll always be stuck here, in this limbo, this half-life we've created for ourselves." His words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. He's right, of course. As much as I want to deny it, as much as I wish I could erase everything that's happened, the truth remains, we can't move on until we face it head-on. "I loved you," I whisper, the words spilling from my lips before I can stop them. Not the way a mother should love her son, but I did. And that terrifies me. "And I loved you," he replies, his voice trembling. In a way I couldn't explain, even to myself. It was wrong, yes, but it was real. And denying that won't change anything. For a long moment, we stand there, locked in each other's gaze, the world around us fading into insignificance. Then, slowly, he reaches out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch is gentle, reverent, as if he's afraid I might shatter under his fingertips. "This is goodbye," he says finally, pulling his hand away. "For good. I can't keep doing this, to you, to me, to our family. It's over." Tears blur my vision as I nod, unable to speak. He turns and walks away, disappearing into the twilight, leaving me alone with the ghosts of our past. As I sit here now, writing these words, I realize the truth. Some stories don't have neat endings, tidy resolutions, or happy conclusions. They're messy, complicated, and often painful. But they're also real. And in their imperfection lies a strange kind of beauty, a reminder that life isn't always black and white, that people make mistakes, and that sometimes, those mistakes shape us in ways we never imagined. But perhaps that shock has taught me something valuable, that love, in all its forms, is powerful enough to destroy us, and strong enough to help us rebuild. Kindly hit the like button for more interesting stories, make sure to share, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching to the end.